Students for a Democratic Society, also known as SDS, was one of the biggest radical movements by students in the United States. SDS was originally formed in 1959 as the youth group of the Social Democratic League for Industrial Democracy, which was a group that educated college students on the labor movement, socialism, and industrial democracy. Later, SDS detached itself from the League for Industrial Democracy in the mid-1960s. SDS was active throughout the 60s on college campuses across the nation. In the mid-60s, they were active in civil rights causes, but later they became more concerned with ending the United States' involvement in Vietnam.
The Student Democratic Society was founded by four individuals: Bill Ayers, Robert Alon Haber, Aryeh Nier, and Tom Hayden. Bill Ayers was an American education theorist. He is known for his 1960s radical activism, his recent work in education reform, curriculum, and instruction. Ayers was part of the Weatherman Underground Organization, which was a radical organization founded at the University of Michigan in 1969. Robert Alon Haber was elected the first president of SDS in 1960. Aryeh Nier was the director of the League of Industrial Democracy, which he later invigorated into the SDS. Nier fired and then rehired Tom Hayden because he had already established his leadership in the group. Tom Hayden was the principal organizer of the Democratic Society. Hayden authorized the SDS Political Manifesto, also known as Port Huron Statement. This document condemned the American political system as the cause of the international conflict and a variety of social skills, including racism, materialism, militarism, and poverty.
The Port Huron Statement, which was written in 1962, was the founding declaration of principles for SDS. The statement raised criticisms of the racial and economic inequality in the United States. The Port Huron Statement. We seek the establishment of a participatory democracy governed by two central aims: that the individual share in those social decisions determining the quality and direction of his life, that society be organized to encourage independence in men and provide the media for their common participation.
Vietnam protest was an involuntary war draft. It was the fourth largest, with 90,000 people killed.
In February 1965, the opposition towards the war heightened when the U.S. began bombing North Vietnam. The amount of protests by SDS increased as well. Back in the 1960s, they had involuntary army drafts, so those American guys selected would be forced to go to the war even if they did not want to. In February and March of 1965, SDS organized marches on the Oakland Army Terminal, which was the departure point for many troops bound for Southeast Asia. In March, SDS intensified the opposition on the war to a national level, calling for a march on Washington to protest the bombings. On April 17, 1965, over 15,000 people gathered at the U.S. Capitol and protested the Vietnam War.
In the early 1960s, a student movement grew in America and confronted what we saw as the country's main problems, especially racism, poverty, and the war in Vietnam.
The important thing about SDS was that it wasn't just a civil rights organization or an anti-war organization, it was a multi-issue organization. One of our slogans at the time was that all of the issues are connected.
Now the war in Vietnam has provided the incredibly sharp razor that has finally separated thousands and thousands of people from their illusions about the decency and morality and integrity of this country's purposes internationally. And that is a bitter and saddening insight for people who grew up as we did, believing the things that we did about our country. What kind of a system is it that justifies the United States or any country in seizing the destinies of other people and using them callously for our own ends? What kind of a system is it that disenfranchises people in the South, that excludes millions and millions of people from the mainstream and promise of American society, that consistently places material values before human values? What kind of a system is that? We must name that system, and we must change it and control it, else it will destroy us.
The students in SDS learned from labor and civil rights organizing traditions. They built chapters around the country and created the largest student movement in our nation's history. They helped end the Vietnam War, fight for civil rights, and affirmative action. built student control in the universities, struggled for speech in times of great government repression, and inspired a generation to change the course of America.
SDS separated into many small factions in 1969. One of the notorious factions was the Weather Underground Organization. The purpose of the Weather Underground Organization was to create a concealed revolutionary party for the overthrow of the U.S. government. The members of the Weather Underground Organization were called the Weathermen, and they committed terroristic acts such as bombings. Many of the bombings were targeted towards policemen and government officials. Sadly, because of the difficult times, government repression, and destructive behaviors like sexism and racism, the organizers of the old SDS gave up on the work of the student movement and disbanded SDS. It ended a student movement that had over 1 million members.
But luckily, SDS was revived again, and it was called the New SDS. The New SDS was born on January 16, 2006, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. A group of high school and college students seeing the pressing need for a broad-based group to unite fractured local student groups worked with members of the old SDS to relaunch the organization. They issued press release calling for a new generation of SDS to build radical multi-issue organization grounded in the principle of participatory democracy. Since then, the new SDS has grown to over 150 chapters around the country, winning victories for over 3 years. The new SDS learned from the successes as well as their mistakes of the old SDS.